The dust of the alien planet swirled, kicked up by the cold wind that howled across the barren landscape. In the distance, the harsh, jagged outline of the raider base loomed like a fortress of iron and stone. Around it, the sounds of cruel laughter echoed, filling the empty, desolate air. The source of that laughter? A small, seemingly fragile figure standing alone before a dozen towering alien raiders. The raiders, massive and imposing with their metallic, armored bodies, mocked him relentlessly. He was barely taller than their knees, his arms thin and spindly, his face covered with a helmet that seemed too large for his small frame. To them, he was nothing more than a curiosity, weak, insignificant. Yet he didn't flinch. He didn't tremble. His stance was unyielding. One of the raiders, a hulking beast of a creature with jagged purple scales and glowing red eyes, stepped forward and sneered. "Is this the mighty warrior we've heard about?" His voice was deep and thunderous, each word dripping with disdain. Another raider, this one with 6 arms and a crown of spiked metal, burst into laughter, his voice echoing through the harsh winds. "I can crush you with a single hand, little one. You are nothing. A toy to amuse us." The small figure did not respond. Instead, he stood there, eyes focused on the horizon. His heart raced, but his face remained stoic. The raiders' mocking only spurred him on, for he knew something they didn't. He wasn't alone. He didn't need to be afraid. The largest raider, the one who had spoken first, took a step closer, towering over the tiny warrior. He reached down, grabbing the small man by the collar of his armor, lifting him off the ground as if he were nothing more than a ragdoll. "You think you're a soldier? You think you stand a chance against us? This is the end for you." For a moment, the world seemed to slow. The air became thick with tension, the raiders eager for the final blow. But the tiny warrior did not flinch. He did not scream. He simply stared at the raider, his eyes steady and filled with an unwavering resolve. Then, just as the raider began to tighten his grip, the ground trembled. It started as a faint vibration underfoot, barely perceptible at first. But then it grew, shaking the earth beneath them. The raiders looked around in confusion, their mocking expressions faltering. The ground rumbled again, louder this time. The wind howled, and the distant sky darkened as a shadow moved across the horizon. The raiders turned, their expressions shifting from cocky amusement to apprehension. Something was coming. And that's when they saw it. A massive figure appeared over the ridge, a silhouette, vast and imposing. It moved with purpose, a force of nature crashing toward them. The air seemed to grow heavier with each step, the trembling ground resonating with the weight of something powerful. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't a weapon. It was a person. The tiny warrior's calm, unwavering demeanor didn't change. He knew who was coming. This was his partner. The one who had taught him everything, the one who had trained him for this moment. The raiders' mocking laughter stopped. Their eyes widened in disbelief. The tiny warrior had not been alone. He had not been helpless. With a roar that shook the very air around them, the towering figure reached the base of the ridge. Standing there, tall and proud, the human partner of the tiny warrior appeared. A hulking man in heavy combat armor, his face covered with a helmet that glowed with a dim blue light. His eyes, visible beneath the visor, locked onto the tiny warrior with a knowing glance. The raiders took a collective step back, fear creeping into their expressions. This was no ordinary human. This was something else entirely. Something far beyond their expectations. The leader of the raiders growled, his voice a guttural growl of frustration. "You brought this, human?" He looked at the tiny warrior, a sneer still on his face. "Do you really think he can save you?" The tiny warrior didn't respond. He merely looked at his human partner, a silent understanding passing between them. Together, they would face this challenge, no matter what it took. The raiders hesitated. The human partner stepped forward, his powerful frame cutting through the air like a storm. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to shift the power in the room. And just as the first raider lunged forward, the human swung into action, his movements swift, precise, and deadly. The battle was about to begin, but the raiders had no idea what they were about to face. The tiny warrior, standing at his partner's side, knew one thing: they had only just begun. The clash was instantaneous. The ground beneath their feet shuddered as the massive human, his armor gleaming in the dim light, charged forward with the force of a freight train. His every movement was calculated, driven by years of training, but more importantly, by a deep sense of loyalty to the small warrior at his side. The first raider, a hulking creature with spiked armor and 4 arms, swung down a massive blade that could have cleaved a building in two. The human raised his arm just in time to deflect the blow with a powerful strike of his own, sending the blade skidding across the dirt. He didn't hesitate. In a fluid motion, he launched forward, delivering a punch that shattered the raider's helmet, sending sparks flying. Behind him, the tiny warrior watched in awe. He had never seen his human partner in action quite like this. The way the man moved, graceful but brutal, was like watching a predator on the hunt. The raiders, once brimming with confidence, now faltered. Another raider, this one armed with twin energy blades, charged toward the human with a vicious battle cry. The human barely seemed to notice, sidestepping with ease and lashing out with his knee, sending the attacker tumbling into a pile of rocks. The sound of bone crunching against stone echoed in the air. But it wasn't all one-sided. The raiders had underestimated the tiny warrior, but now they were beginning to realize their mistake. One of them, a beastly alien with a body that seemed to be a living mass of molten rock, shot forward, releasing a blast of intense heat from its chest. The human recoiled slightly, but his movements were too swift, and he was already behind cover before the blast could reach him. That's when the tiny warrior made his move. While the human held the line, engaging the raiders head-on, the small figure darted between the chaos, moving with a speed that belied his size. He wasn't a fighter in the traditional sense, he lacked the raw strength or size of his human partner, but he possessed something else: agility, intelligence, and a deep understanding of the battlefield. As the human took on the larger threats, the tiny warrior saw an opportunity. A raider with an exposed flank. He moved quickly, silently, his footfalls barely making a sound on the cracked earth beneath him. He leapt up, landing behind the raider, and with one swift motion, he drove a small but incredibly sharp blade into the creature's unprotected side. The raider let out a strangled scream, collapsing to the ground. The raiders hesitated, shock filling their faces. It was one thing to see the human, a force of nature in his own right, but another entirely to witness the small warrior strike with such precision. They had underestimated him in every way, and now they were paying the price. The leader of the raiders, a towering alien with a face covered in obsidian-like armor, stepped forward, his eyes blazing with fury. "Enough," he roared, his voice carrying a powerful force that shook the air. He raised his hand, and the remaining raiders stopped in their tracks. The tiny warrior and his human partner both paused, their weapons ready, eyes fixed on the leader. This was the moment. The last battle, the final showdown. The leader's eyes locked onto the tiny warrior, who had moved to stand beside the human, a quiet determination settling in his gaze. "You think you can stop us?" the leader sneered. "You think you can defeat the mighty raiders? We are invincible." The human's voice cut through the tension, low and firm. "No. You're just bullies, picking on those weaker than you. It ends here." The leader let out a mocking laugh. "You speak of ending things? You speak of victory? We are the conquerors of galaxies, and yet, you think you can defeat us here?" The tiny warrior looked up at his human partner, his heart pounding in his chest. They both knew the truth. It wasn't about physical strength. It wasn't about weapons or size. It was about the heart. The courage to stand tall in the face of overwhelming odds, to rise when the world seemed determined to crush you. And that's exactly what they were about to do. With a single nod from his human partner, the tiny warrior sprang forward, moving faster than any of the raiders could react. He darted around the leader's massive form, attacking with precision, distracting him just enough to allow the human to close in. The leader, furious, swung a mighty arm, trying to land a blow on the tiny warrior, but he was met with the unforgiving strength of the human, who launched himself at the leader with a power that was almost unnatural. The battle that followed was swift and brutal. Every strike from the human landed with deadly accuracy, his blows cutting through the air like thunder. The leader, overwhelmed by the combined force of the human and the tiny warrior's distraction, struggled to keep up. And then, in the final moment, it happened. The human lunged, grabbing the leader by his throat with one massive hand. With a roar, he lifted the alien off the ground, slamming him down into the dust. The raiders watched in stunned silence as their leader lay defeated before them. The human stood tall, his chest heaving with effort. Beside him, the tiny warrior lowered his weapon, his face calm. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind and the occasional crackle of distant thunder. Then, the raiders began to retreat, their morale shattered. One by one, they turned and fled, leaving the two warriors standing alone amidst the wreckage of their battle. The tiny warrior looked up at his human partner, and for the first time, he allowed himself a small, knowing smile. They had done it. They had overcome the impossible, and they had done it together. The dust from the battle still hung thick in the air, the acrid scent of burning alien metal and scorched earth lingering long after the raiders had fled. The tiny warrior stood motionless, staring at the path the raiders had taken, while his human partner slowly lowered his weapon. The moment had passed, but the tension lingered, settling into the pit of their stomachs. "Is it over?" the tiny warrior asked quietly, his voice barely a whisper over the wind. The human didn't answer right away. Instead, he wiped his brow with the back of his hand, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't need to say it. The tiny warrior already knew. "We'll see," the human replied, his voice gruff. "They'll come back. They always do." The tiny warrior's gaze dropped to the ground. He had expected a victory, a clear end to the threat, but the truth was stark: the raiders wouldn't stop. They were too powerful, too relentless. And they knew how to strike where it hurt. "What do we do now?" the tiny warrior asked, looking up at his human partner, his eyes filled with uncertainty. The human looked back at him, his expression softening slightly. "We keep moving. We'll find their base, and we'll put an end to it." The tiny warrior hesitated, but then nodded. He trusted the human. They had been through so much together, and each battle only solidified that trust. But this was different. The stakes had never been higher. They walked in silence, moving across the desolate landscape toward the mountains that loomed in the distance. The journey would be long and dangerous, but they had no choice. Their mission was clear: find the raiders' base and destroy it, before they could return to wreak more havoc. As they moved, the tiny warrior couldn't help but think back to the battle. The human's strength had been undeniable, but it wasn't just his physical power that had made the difference. It was his unwavering belief in them. In their partnership. The human had seen potential in the tiny warrior long before anyone else had, and that trust had pushed them both to heights they hadn't thought possible. But the tiny warrior also knew that there were limits to how much they could do alone. The human was a force to be reckoned with, but even he couldn't take on an entire army by himself. They would need help. They would need to rally others. "We'll need allies," the tiny warrior said, his voice thoughtful. "More people, more soldiers. We can't do this alone." The human glanced at him, considering. "You're right," he said slowly. "But we can't just trust anyone. We have to be careful who we bring into this." I know, the tiny warrior replied. But we can't win without others. They kept walking, the weight of the task ahead settling heavier with every step. Their path took them through rocky terrain, across barren deserts, and over jagged cliffs. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that stretched across the land. There was a sense of urgency now. Time was slipping away, and the raiders weren't going to wait. But as the night grew darker, something unexpected happened. A faint sound reached their ears. A rustling in the distance, followed by the unmistakable hum of a vehicle's engine. The tiny warrior's senses immediately heightened, his eyes darting to the horizon. "Stay low," the human whispered, his voice like steel. "We don't know who it is." The tiny warrior nodded, instinctively falling into a crouch as they moved behind a large rock formation. The sound of the engine grew louder, and then, out of the darkness, a single speeder appeared, moving quickly across the desert. The human's grip tightened on his weapon, ready for anything. But as the speeder drew closer, the tiny warrior's heart skipped a beat. The figure in the driver's seat was familiar. It was a woman, one of the resistance fighters they had met in the early days of their journey. The tiny warrior's eyes widened. "It's her," he said, his voice barely a breath. "It's Kayla." The human didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, stepping out from behind cover, his weapon lowered but ready. The speeder slowed as it approached, and Kayla, a fierce but kind-hearted woman with short, dark hair and a scar running down her cheek, stopped just short of them. Well, Kayla said, her lips curling into a smile. "I thought I'd find you two out here. Thought you could run away from the raiders, huh?" "We're not running," the human replied, his voice firm. "We're stopping them." Kayla's eyes flicked to the tiny warrior, then back to the human. "That's what I like to hear." She hesitated for a moment, then added, "But you'll need more than just the two of you. The raiders have regrouped. They're coming for you. I've got word from the scouts." The tiny warrior's heart sank. He had hoped they had bought themselves some time, but it seemed the raiders weren't giving up so easily. "I knew they wouldn't stay down long," the tiny warrior said, his voice tight with frustration. "We can't keep running from them." Kayla met his gaze, and for a brief moment, there was understanding between them. They had both been through hell together, and neither of them was ready to back down. "No," she agreed. "We don't run. We fight. And we find more of us. The resistance is scattered, but they're out there. We've got to rally them. We've got to hit the raiders where it hurts." The human nodded, his expression hardening. "Then let's do it. We don't have time to waste." They climbed into the speeder, and with a roar of the engine, they sped off into the night, the horizon stretching out before them. The tiny warrior sat next to the human, a fire of determination burning in his chest. This was it. The final push. The resistance. The fight for their survival. There was no turning back now. The speeder raced across the barren desert, its engine humming in the quiet night air. The wind whipped through the tiny warrior's hair, but his focus remained sharp. Kayla had led them to a hidden base, an abandoned mining town deep in the hills, away from the prying eyes of the raiders. It was the perfect place to regroup, to make their final stand. The tiny warrior looked to the horizon, his thoughts heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. He had always believed that humanity's strength lay in its ability to adapt, to fight even when the odds were stacked against them. But now, he wondered, could they really defeat an enemy as powerful as the raiders? "We'll need more," Kayla said, breaking his thoughts. She was speaking to the human, who was sitting next to her in the front of the speeder. "I've sent out the word, but I'm not sure how many will come." "You've got a whole army out here," the human replied, his voice low but steady. "We'll find them. We'll make them believe." Kayla glanced back over her shoulder at the tiny warrior. Her eyes were sharp, calculating. "You ready for this?" Because once we start, there's no stopping. The tiny warrior nodded. His eyes locked with hers. There was a fire in his gaze, an unwavering determination that he couldn't shake. He had spent too long running, too long fighting alone. He wasn't going to stop now. Let's do it, he said simply. Kayla gave a curt nod and pressed the throttle, the speeder surging forward once more. The barren landscape slowly transformed as they neared the abandoned mining town. The broken structures and rusted equipment stood as silent witnesses to what had once been. Now, it was a place of refuge for those who had nowhere else to turn. The tiny warrior felt the weight of their mission settling heavily on his shoulders. This town, this small group of rebels, it was all they had. And in that moment, it wasn't just about survival. It was about fighting for a future. When they reached the base, they were greeted by a few faces the tiny warrior recognized. A few familiar fighters, hardened by battle, met them with cautious glances but no words. It wasn't just a matter of survival anymore, it was about trust. Trust in the tiny warrior, and in the human who had helped him get this far. Kayla led them into a large, crumbling building. Inside, a makeshift command center was set up, dim lights flickering overhead, and scattered tables covered with maps, equipment, and communication devices. The air was thick with the tension of those preparing for war. The human immediately stepped forward, his presence commanding. "Gather everyone. We need to talk." Within moments, the room was filled with people, soldiers, resistance fighters, and civilians who had been swept into the conflict by necessity, not by choice. They stood together, but there was a palpable divide between them, the ones who had fought for years, and the ones who had only just joined. It wasn't an easy alliance to form. The tiny warrior, standing beside the human and Kayla, took a deep breath, knowing that the next few moments could change everything. If they couldn't convince these fighters to join forces, they were all as good as dead. "Listen up," the human began, his voice steady and strong. "I know the odds are stacked against us. But we've been fighting these raiders for a long time. They've taken everything from us. Our homes, our families. But we're not done. Not yet." The tiny warrior stepped forward, his voice quieter but no less firm. "I've seen what these raiders can do. I've seen the destruction they leave in their wake. But we're not helpless. We have each other. We have the strength of humanity, the will to fight for what's right." There was a heavy silence in the room. Eyes flicked from one person to another. Doubt hung in the air like a thick fog. Then, slowly, a voice broke the quiet. A tall man with graying hair stepped forward. He had the look of someone who had seen the worst of humanity's battles and was tired of fighting. "And what makes you think this time will be any different? We've fought, and we've lost. Every time. What makes you think we'll win now?" The tiny warrior met his gaze, unflinching. "Because we have something they don't. Hope. We may be small, but we fight with everything we have. And together, we can stand against them. We can take them down." The graying man looked at the tiny warrior for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. But then, he nodded slowly. "You've got fire in you. I'll follow you." The room seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The tiny warrior felt his chest swell with pride. It wasn't just about fighting. It was about leading. It was about inspiring the others to believe in themselves. More voices spoke up, one after another. People who had been holding back, people who had been afraid of the raiders, afraid of losing, now felt the spark of something greater. Hope. Unity. And for the first time in a long time, they believed they could win. Kayla stepped forward, a smirk playing at the corner of her mouth. "Looks like we've got ourselves an army after all." The human grinned, a rare sight. "Let's make sure we don't waste it." The tiny warrior looked around at the faces of those who had now become part of his cause. It was overwhelming. They weren't just soldiers. They were fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters. They were people who had been pushed to their breaking point, but who had never lost the will to fight. And now, they would stand together. They would fight together. But the tiny warrior knew that the real battle hadn't even started yet. The raiders would come soon, and when they did, everything would be on the line. But for the first time, the tiny warrior felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt ready. Ready to lead, ready to fight. Ready to win. The morning light was faint on the horizon, painting the desert sky with hues of orange and purple. The tiny warrior stood at the edge of the base, his eyes locked on the barren land beyond. The wind stirred the dust around him, but he didn't move. The time had come. Behind him, the base had come alive. Soldiers, fighters, and civilians alike were preparing for the battle that would determine their future. Kayla and the human were coordinating the final steps of their plan, working in unison to get the resistance fighters ready for the raiders' impending assault. The tiny warrior's thoughts raced. He had always been a soldier, but this felt different. This wasn't just a mission. This was their last stand. If they failed, there would be no tomorrow. But he wasn't about to let that happen. Kayla approached him, her eyes sharp with determination. "You good?" she asked, her voice steady, but the concern in her eyes was evident. He gave her a quick nod, but she could see it, the unease he was trying to hide. The human beside her gave a reassuring smile. "Don't worry. You've got this." For a brief moment, the tiny warrior allowed himself a soft breath. He had done the hard part, he had united these people, made them believe that they could win. Now, they just needed to prove it. But the enemy was coming. And they were coming fast. The small group of soldiers moved quickly, taking up positions in the ruined structures surrounding the base. It wasn't much, there were only a few dozen of them, but every person here had a purpose. Every single one was. He paused, letting his words sink in. His eyes scanned the crowd, each face full of determination, but also fear. They were scared, but they were also ready. Ready to fight. Ready to defend. "We fight for each other," the tiny warrior continued. "We fight for everything we've lost, and everything we still have left. We are stronger together than they'll ever be. And today, we show them what humanity is capable of." A cheer broke out among the fighters. It wasn't loud, but it was fierce. The tiny warrior saw the resolve in their eyes. This wasn't just a battle for survival, it was a fight for their future. Without another word, they dispersed into their positions. The tiny warrior moved to the front lines, Kayla and the human at his side. His pulse quickened as the sound of the raiders' ships grew louder, the rumble of their engines shaking the ground beneath them. The first raider ship appeared in the distance, massive, dark, and foreboding. It was only a few miles out. The tiny warrior's hand tightened around his weapon. He had never faced an enemy like this before. The raiders were ruthless, but they had underestimated one thing: humanity's will to survive. Suddenly, the first explosion rang out, lighting up the desert sky. A raider ship had landed. Then the second explosion. And the third. The raiders had arrived. The tiny warrior's heart raced, but he steadied himself. This was it. There was no turning back now. He watched as the raiders began to disembark, their heavy armor gleaming in the light. They were huge, towering over the humans, their weapons designed to annihilate. But the tiny warrior was unfazed. He had prepared for this moment, and he wasn't about to let fear control him now. The first wave of raiders began to advance, and the tiny warrior raised his weapon. Kayla and the human were right beside him, ready for whatever came next. They were ready to fight, and they would make sure the raiders felt every blow. Gunfire erupted as the two sides collided. The tiny warrior moved quickly, ducking behind cover, taking out raiders one by one. The sounds of explosions, shouts, and gunfire filled the air. His heart pounded in his chest, but he stayed focused. This was their moment. This was their chance to show the raiders just how wrong they were. But even as the humans pushed back, the raiders kept coming. More ships landed, more soldiers emerged. It seemed like an endless tide of enemies, but the tiny warrior didn't back down. He couldn't. Not now. Kayla's voice rang out from across the battlefield. We're holding them off, but we need reinforcements. Where are they? The human cursed under his breath. They're coming. They have to be. And then, just as hope began to wane, the distant sound of engines hummed across the battlefield. The tiny warrior looked up, and his heart leaped. More reinforcements were arriving, human fighters, from all over the desert, flooding the battlefield in waves. The tiny warrior's resolve strengthened. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for each other. As the tide of battle shifted in their favor, the tiny warrior realized that this was not just about winning. It was about showing the raiders that humanity would never back down. And that was the strongest weapon they had. The battle raged on, the sound of gunfire and explosions mingling with the cries of soldiers, the very earth beneath them trembling with each impact. The desert had become a war zone, a hellscape where only the strongest would survive. The tiny warrior was exhausted, but there was no time to rest. His body ached, his limbs screamed for relief, but he pushed through it. He had no choice. The enemy was relentless, and every second that passed, they lost ground. His eyes scanned the horizon, looking for any sign of weakness, any opening in the enemy's defense. Beside him, Kayla fired her weapon with precision, her eyes never leaving the raiders as they advanced. Her movements were fluid, almost mechanical, but even she couldn't deny the toll the battle was taking on her. Sweat dripped down her face, but there was no time to wipe it away. The human was at her side, doing what he could to support, rallying the soldiers as best as he could. He had been a leader, but now, in the heat of battle, he was just another soldier, fighting, bleeding, surviving. The tiny warrior's breath caught as he saw something that made his heart drop. A group of raiders, armed to the teeth, was advancing on their position. They were huge, almost towering over the humans, and they moved with a deadly grace, effortlessly cutting through the resistance's forces. We need to take them down, now, the human shouted over the roar of the battle. He turned to Kayla, his face a mask of determination. Get the troops to fall back. We need to hold them here, or we're done. Kayla didn't hesitate. She barked orders, directing the fighters to fall back to a more defensible position. But the tiny warrior knew that wouldn't be enough. They couldn't keep falling back. They had to make a stand. Without warning, the tiny warrior charged, running straight into the fray. His weapon was raised, and he moved with a fierce speed, weaving in and out of the raiders' lines. His small size, once considered a disadvantage, now worked to his benefit. He was quick, agile, harder to hit than the towering raiders. He fired shot after shot, taking down one raider after another, but there were too many of them. He could feel the exhaustion creeping up on him, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close. Kayla and the human were right behind him, backing him up as best they could, but it was clear that their resistance was beginning to falter. The raiders were more organized, more prepared. It seemed like nothing could stop them. The tiny warrior's heart pounded in his chest. He knew they were fighting for survival, but there was something more at stake. This was about humanity's future. This was about showing the raiders that no matter how small they were, no matter how weak they seemed, they would never be defeated. He paused for a moment, catching his breath, his eyes scanning the battlefield. Then, something caught his attention. A large raider ship had landed behind their lines, its engines roaring to life as troops disembarked. The tiny warrior's stomach sank. This was it, the reinforcements they had feared were coming in force. He turned to the human, urgency in his voice. "We need to destroy that ship, now." The human nodded, his face set in grim determination. "I'll go with you," he said. But the tiny warrior shook his head. "No. I'll do it alone." Kayla's eyes widened in protest. "Are you out of your mind? We can't afford to lose you." "I'll be fine," the tiny warrior insisted. "I have to do this. We don't have a choice." With that, he sprinted toward the enemy ship, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the sounds of battle all around him, but nothing mattered more than this. He had to stop the raiders' reinforcements, or they were finished. He reached the ship, his hands shaking as he set explosives on its hull. Sweat stung his eyes, but he didn't stop. Time was running out. He knew the raiders would be looking for him soon, if they didn't already know he was there. A sudden explosion rocked the ground beneath him, and the tiny warrior stumbled, barely managing to stay on his feet. He looked up, his eyes widening as he saw a group of raiders charging toward him, weapons raised. He was outnumbered, outgunned, but he wasn't afraid. Not anymore. He grabbed the detonator from his belt, his finger hovering over the button. He could hear the raiders closing in, their heavy footsteps pounding the earth. There was no time to waste. With a final, determined breath, he pressed the button. The explosion was deafening. The ground shook violently as the raider ship erupted in a fiery blaze. The force of the blast sent the tiny warrior flying backward, but he landed hard on the ground, barely managing to stay conscious. The battle stopped for a brief moment as the raiders recoiled from the explosion. But it wasn't over. Far from it. The tiny warrior could see that the tide was beginning to turn. The raiders were stunned, their forces momentarily disoriented. It was their chance. He pushed himself up, his body screaming in protest, and looked around. Kayla, the human, and the rest of the resistance fighters were regrouping, taking advantage of the confusion to strike back harder. But the tiny warrior knew that the final test was yet to come. They had done a lot, but this wasn't over. Not yet. He could still see the raiders regrouping, pulling together for one last push. He knew what needed to happen next. The battlefield was quieter now, the echoes of explosions and gunfire fading into a tense silence. Smoke still billowed from the wreckage of the raider ship, the fire illuminating the darkening sky, but the war wasn't over. The resistance had gained a brief advantage, but they knew the raiders were far from finished. They had regrouped, reorganized, and their final assault was already underway. The tiny warrior staggered to his feet, his body battered and bruised, but his resolve was stronger than ever. The dust in the air stung his eyes, but he didn't blink. He couldn't afford to. He looked around at the faces of the soldiers who had followed him, the soldiers who had fought beside him against all odds. His comrades were no longer just allies, they were family. They had all put their trust in him, and now, he had to make sure they didn't lose everything. Beside him, Kayla was reloading her weapon, her face etched with the same determination. She had been there for him through every step of this fight, and he couldn't help but feel a deep respect for her. The human, too, was ready for the next phase, his brow furrowed with concern but his eyes steady. They all knew the cost of this war, how high the stakes had become, but there was no turning back now. "Everyone, fall back to the last line," the human shouted, his voice cutting through the tension. "This is it. We hold this position, or we don't leave here." The tiny warrior didn't respond with words. Instead, he just nodded, his mind already working on what needed to happen next. They couldn't afford to fall back anymore. They had already given so much ground. The raiders were relentless, but so were they. "Are you ready?" Kayla asked, her voice tight with anticipation. The tiny warrior looked her squarely in the eye. "We don't run. Not anymore. With that, he turned and charged forward, not waiting for anyone to follow. His every step was a testament to the strength that had driven him from the very beginning, the same strength that had made him take on an entire army, the same strength that had made him a symbol of hope for humanity. As he ran, the sound of his comrades following him reached his ears. They were with him. They would face whatever came next, together. The raiders had reformed their lines. Their leader, a massive figure clad in thick armor, stood at the front, a weapon unlike anything the tiny warrior had ever seen in his hands. It was a machine designed to tear through anything in its path. It was the final test. The tiny warrior's heart pounded, but his resolve was unshakable. He could see the fear in the eyes of his comrades, but he wasn't afraid. This wasn't just about survival. This was about something bigger. He reached the front line, his weapon raised, and without hesitation, he fired. The shot rang out, hitting the leader's shield with a resounding clash. The raiders responded instantly, their weapons trained on him, but he was ready. He dodged, moving with the speed that had become his trademark, using every ounce of his agility to outmaneuver them. The fight was brutal. Kayla and the human were right behind him, each of them picking off raiders with deadly precision, but the leader was still standing, his towering form looming over them all. The tiny warrior knew what he had to do. He sprinted toward the leader, his heart in his throat, knowing that this was the moment that could change everything. He had no time for hesitation. The leader raised his weapon, the massive gun aimed straight at him. With a final surge of energy, the tiny warrior leapt into the air, his body moving faster than any of the raiders could react. He landed on the leader's back, his knife sinking into the raider's neck in a precise strike. The leader let out a terrible roar, but it was too late. The raider fell, crumbling to the ground. The battlefield fell silent. For a moment, it seemed like everything had stopped. The raiders were frozen, staring at the tiny warrior who had just taken down their leader. It was a moment of pure triumph, but the warrior knew the fight was far from over. The battle was won, but there was still much left to do. The raiders turned and began retreating, their morale shattered by the fall of their leader. The tiny warrior watched them flee, his chest heaving with exhaustion, but a sense of satisfaction slowly spreading through him. They had done it. They had won. Against all odds, against overwhelming force, they had managed to push the raiders back. As the smoke began to clear, the tiny warrior lowered his weapon, his body shaking from the strain. He turned to Kayla and the human, who were both standing behind him, their faces lit with the same sense of relief. They had made it. The human clapped him on the back. "You did it, kid. You saved us all." Kayla nodded, her eyes filled with admiration. "You're not just a soldier. You're a symbol." The tiny warrior smiled, though his body felt as if it would collapse at any moment. "We're all symbols," he said quietly. "We did this together." As the survivors of the battle began to regroup, the tiny warrior stood tall, looking out over the battlefield. There was no time to rest. The war wasn't over, and he knew that there would be more battles to fight. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. This was the strength of humanity, their ability to fight, to rise above, and to never give up, no matter the odds. It was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. And as he looked out at the horizon, knowing there would be more challenges ahead, he realized that this battle, this victory, wasn't just about fighting for survival. It was about fighting for something greater, hope, unity, and the belief that no matter how small you were, you could make a difference. The battle had been won, but the war for humanity's future had just begun.